San Francisco scene was very excited by this. We could feel this was the next wave. And so we wanted to, so then if we hadn't heard of him, now's the chance to see him. Now's, go down and spend 3 days and see them all.
Monterey, incredible, important transition, catalyst for huge change, and people came in that weekend on the top, Mamas and Papas, 6 straight top 10 hits, The Association, Simon and Garfunkel. By the end of the weekend, everybody was talking about Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, Otis Redding, Big Brother and the Holding Company. And the whole world had revolved in 3 days.
Monterey was the first of the pop music festivals, and it had a great feeling about it. I mean, there was a lot of optimism in the air, along with the smell of marijuana. And for me, watching that festival, the highlight was Janis Joplin, because I'd seen Hendrix and I'd seen The Who. I knew how good they were. I'd flown out with Hendrix. But when Janis Joplin came on that stage and opened her mouth, I just took 2 steps back. I just never heard a woman sing like that in my life.
Everyone was there. Derek Taylor from the Beatles publicist put this whole thing together, and a lot of people were there, so a lot of people saw her kill it. I mean, she was great that night.
Rather than being at a relatively small, semi-provincial American city, all of a sudden San Francisco was challenging LA. LA was the West Coast center of popular music, the movies, and all that was all LA. And San Francisco had very little part in that. But now, the Grateful Dead was San Francisco. Janis Joplin was San Francisco. San Francisco that summer became a pop music capital where it had not been before.
And in attendance at this historic festival was a Rolling Stone. Brian Jones, still awaiting sentencing, had travelled to the event, keen to witness firsthand the fruits of this new counterculture.
Brian Jones appearing in the audience at Monterey Pop, hanging out with Nico, was important to the scene. They recognized that as, British rock royalty anointing the festival. So the Stones were represented there. It would be the underpinnings of what would lead them into Altamont, because they felt somewhat separate from this hip underground movement, and they really wanted to be part of it. Jagger especially wanted that for his band.
But it was neither the Stones nor the West Coast acts who would provide the definitive musical statement of this new countercultural mindset. In a remarkable creative surge, with the LP Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the single All You Need Is Love, it was the Beatles who captured the spirit of the Summer of Love.
1967 really was owned by the Beatles. There was all this thing happening over on the West Coast, but All You Need Is Love, it was so right for its time. A summer of love that was, like all the best flowers, they just die off after a couple of months. But All You Need Is Love was the single song that symbolized that. They also had Sgt. Pepper on the album market, which, you had reviewers in the Times saying, this is genuine art. This isn't pop music, this is art.
In my whole career of following music, and now it's 50, 60 years, there was nothing ever, and there hasn't been since, something like Sgt. Pepper. This was big. Sgt. Pepper blew everybody's mind. Everybody found something to like in it. And it was powerful, powerful music.
In late July, Jagger and Richards successfully appealed against their convictions, and the pair were free men once again. Determined to keep up with the Beatles, the Stones quickly reassembled and issued their own contributions to the Summer of Love. But the single We Love You and the album that followed, the much maligned Satanic Majesty's Request, offered a less celebratory vision of the times and failed to chime with the utopian mood of the era.
The Rolling Stones and Peace and Love might seem unlikely bedfellows, but Jagger and Richards were there at the recording of All You Need Is Love. And in fact, their single, which follows that, We Love You, I think is a masterpiece. The Rolling Stones are, and Jagger and Richards in particular, are right in the firing line at this point. So peace and love with an edge, because they are being targeted and victimized.
It wasn't anything like All You Need Is Love. It was sardonic, it was ironic almost, the way they sang that. It wasn't inclusive and upbeat and playful and fun and international. So the Stones weren't really playing ball.
The Stones are hardened. They never fully bit on all the idealism of the 60s. They were tougher. It was like a London thing in part. They were city kids. You know, so all of this get back to the land and, you know, wear flowers in your hair and all that business, that didn't really work for them so well. They didn't think, you know, because you went to the park with your friends and waved a flag around that anybody was going to give up anything important. They totally understood that that was never going to happen.
And the Stones' reluctance to join in with the prevailing optimism was borne out by the more disturbing events that occurred during the Summer of Love. In June 1967, 10,000 peace marchers were violently attacked by police during a demonstration in Los Angeles. While the following month, race riots erupted in Detroit, leaving dozens killed and hundreds injured.
Even as the Summer of Love was proffering this kind of vision of a new world, there were plenty of problems, and everything didn't disappear, because you took a pill one day. We can transform things by, smoking pot. It was just not realistic. And soon everyone learned how unrealistic it was.
The growth of the counterculture occurs at exactly the same time that the Black Ghetto is rising up in force in Detroit and in many other places. So you have these two simultaneous, not exactly related movements, but both of them give you a feeling that everything is changing and a lot of things are under siege in a way they never were before. But certainly the riots in the Black Ghettos are the most destabilizing force in the country and the one that terrifies white people the most, even more than long-haired rock and rollers, clearly.
The stage was set for harder times to follow, and at the very start of 1968, the counterculture's faith in the authorities crumbled even further. Victory in Vietnam was always presented as a certainty, the inevitable end to a just crusade. But the news reports that broadcast during the Tet Offensive offered all of America a very different vision of the war.
William Westmoreland, who's the commanding Army general for the United States in Vietnam, has come home to America in the fall of 1967 and said that the war is being won and that we have nothing to worry about and that we're about to turn the corner. And of course, famously, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And then at the end of January of 1968, you have every major city in South Vietnam and every major military outpost attacked simultaneously in honor of the Tet holiday. And you have Vietnamese, including some who had worked for the American embassy, inside the American embassy attacking it. And those images of people inside the embassy compound, as well as the general mayhem around the country, have a very dramatic and immediate effect.
It was very clear that the light at the end of the tunnel just really didn't exist. That was a fantasy that was being sold to the American people to justify their sons going over to fight this war. Once that became part of people's awareness of what was going on in Vietnam, the tide began to turn. But there was resistance to that. My country, right or wrong, that was something you heard all the time back then. Even if Vietnam was not justifiable, you had to get behind it. And, you know, young people who were kind of expected to go fight that war were thinking, well, I don't think so. I don't see it that way. The battle was on.
And this battle was not restricted to America's home turf. The youth and peace movements were active internationally, and in Europe, large demonstrations were organized to oppose the Vietnam War. And although Britain had seen peaceful marches for nuclear disarmament since the start of the decade, in March 1968, outside the US Embassy in London, the protests descended into violence.
After the flowers had wilted, there was a reality check, and the reality check, Vietnam was becoming an issue that spread amongst young people right around the world. It was the Cold War really getting out of control, Vietnam. Young lives were being lost, and people were asking questions as to why. Britain wasn't sending the forces over, but there was some tacit support of the USA.
And amongst the protesters, observing as the police and the demonstrators clashed, was Mick Jagger himself. Since his trial, the frontman's role in the counterculture had been transformed, and he now positioned himself on the front lines.
Jagger's very interesting in terms of his role in the counterculture, because there is this instinctive desire just to be yobbish and put your two fingers up. But he's also got this LSE education. He is attracted by some of the intellectual ideas that are underpinning these notions of different ways of organising society. And he starts appearing on British TV, debating with Malcolm Muggeridge and Mary Whitehouse and these figures who represented a really reactionary attitude at the time. The opportunity to go on TV and debate why he felt society was being organised on the wrong lines was very attractive to him. And then it becomes part of his songwriting as well.
And this would come at a perfect time. The confrontational mood in Europe was further escalated in May, when student riots erupted in Paris. The resistance soon spread to the French workers themselves, and the streets became a battleground, with protesters calling for a revolution. Into this turbulence came the Rolling Stones' new single, Jumping Jack Flash.
You had Grosvenor Square, but you also had activism in Berlin, in Paris, and youth was becoming an international force in a way like that. And the Stones, when they got their kind of mojo back to the tough R&B, they were great symbols for that. So when you had the Beatles in '67 embodying everything that was happening then, the Stones were poised really to embody the darker energies that were kind of unfolding during '68.
I remember the first time I heard Jumpin' Jack Flash, just thinking like, wow, the Stones are back. Driven by a riff and driven by a kind of rebellious message. It was exactly, what that moment seemed to call for.
That started them off. It kicked everything off with the Jumping Jack Flash. I mean, born in a crossfire hurricane, and all of the language that was in that thing, it was like identifying for all those people, felt like, life was crazy. You had Vietnam's coming, all these other things going on. So yes, born in a crossfire, re-kicked everything and rekindled it.
But where the Stones were being revitalized, the American political landscape was reeling from further tragedies. In April, civil rights leader Martin Luther King had been assassinated, sparking off riots in more than 110 cities. The greatest wave of social unrest the country had experienced since the Civil War. Despite the turbulence, there was one political figure who offered hope. Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of slain President John, was a leading candidate for the Democratic Party to succeed Lyndon Johnson. An advocate of human rights and social justice, and an opponent of the Vietnam War, he suggested that change could occur from within the political system. Yet on June the 5th, 1968, shortly after winning the Californian primary, he too was assassinated.
He did represent hope, and even to people who hadn't necessarily invested in it, they knew him to be that. And the robbery was felt very strongly throughout the youth culture.
Those two assassinations did more to destroy optimism than anything else in my lifetime. And of course, really, it was 3 assassinations in the minds of us who came of age in the 60s, because it was John Kennedy, and then it was King, and then it was Bobby Kennedy. So those were the 3 most horrifying events of my youth.
The main thing, I think, when you think back on that period was just how saturated with violence the culture was. The idea of putting any kind of hope in any of these figures was beginning to look faintly ridiculous, because so many of them were being killed, violently in front of our eyes.
And for the counterculture, the idea of peace and love lost its allure, and revolution became their rallying cry. Many of those involved in the youth movement solely for the sex, drugs, and rock and roll now became politically active. And this reached its boiling point at a mass demonstration at the Democratic National Convention in August 1968.
Well, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago shaped up to be a coronation of Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president and hand-picked successor that nobody cared one whit about. And the sort of National Council of unaffiliated hippies, who called themselves the Yippies, determined to create a diversion, a strike, a demonstration outside the convention headquarters. And they called on youth all over the country to descend on Chicago. The fact is, Chicago was run by a mayor, tough guy named Richard Daley, and he just didn't see any reason these kids should be allowed to do anything. So it was a battle in the streets outside the Democratic Convention. There were thousands of kids getting clobbered and tear gassed and hauled off to jail by the Chicago police, who were acting for all intents and purposes like a Nazi police festival in the 30s.
The police riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968 were absolutely a dividing line. It totally radicalized youth culture. One of the chants of the protesters at the Chicago Convention was, "The whole world is watching." And that there was that sense of, once you've seen this, you can't look away, you can't unsee it, you can't pretend. You had to line up on one side or another.
Just as these images of vicious police brutality were being broadcast worldwide, the Rolling Stones released the single Street Fighting Man, inspired by the Grosvenor Square riots earlier that year. Declared a subversive record, it was instantly banned by radio stations in Chicago and reinforced the group's anti-establishment credentials.
Street Fighting Man captured the feeling of the time, both in America and here. But Jagger was always good at sensing that. He always had that ability. It was one of his strengths as a songwriter.
Everywhere I hear the sound of Martin George beat, boy. 'Cause summer's here and the time is right for fighting in the street, boy.
Blood was running in the streets. The temperatures were rising really fast. It had changed so much in that year, from All You Need Is Love in 1967, Street Fighting Man in 1968.
Timing is everything, and to have that song come out at that moment made them right at the center of the zeitgeist in a way that they probably hadn't been for several years before. And it's true that the absolute peak of the Beatles was with Sgt. Pepper's in 1967, although we have to remember that Hey Jude was also in 1968. And Dylan's most powerful political stuff was by 1968 behind him. So yeah, I would say that the Rolling Stones at that moment were probably the most powerful political force in the rock and roll scene.
And the Stones' resurgence was confirmed at the close of the year with the album Beggar's Banquet. Promoted with a drunken press party, it was a time for celebration, with not only Jagger and Richards, but also Brian Jones having narrowly avoided prison time during a difficult year. Yet the wider counterculture was not feeling so celebratory, with the presidential election of Republican candidate Richard Nixon in November pouring salt on the wounds that had been inflicted during 1968. The Stones' new LP and its standout opening track, Sympathy for the Devil, demonstrated their continued relevance and resistance to the existing order.
Anyone who had doubts about what the Stones were up to after Satanic Majesty's request had those doubts erased by Beggar's Banquet. If you watch the footage of the movie they made with, Jean-Luc Godard, they're recording Sympathy for the Devil, and in the course of making the movie, you see Jagger having to change the lyrics from "I shouted out who killed Kennedy" to "I shouted out who killed the Kennedys."
I watch with glee while you kings and queens mama tender gaze for the God save me. I shouted out, kill the Kennedy. Well, after all, it was you and me.
When you have to make a revision like that, you know that you're operating right on the cutting edge of what's going on. As the track that announced Beggar's Banquet, it couldn't possibly have been a stronger statement.
Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name.
Jagger married a hedonism to an enjoyment of that sort of Lord of Misrule role. That's what comes across in songs like Sympathy for the Devil. He falls in love, I think, with this role of the Lord of Misrule, bringing chaos and turbulence in its wake. And it's very attractive, but equally rather dangerous at the same time.
While the Stones were busy re-establishing themselves in this anarchic role, another scene had developed in Britain over the past 2 years. Inspired by the San Francisco psychedelic acts, the bands of the underground had also experimented with light shows and elongated song forms at the circuit's main club, UFO. In 1968, the scene's leading lights, the Pink Floyd, headlined the first major free concert in London's Hyde Park, organised by Black Hill Enterprises. And following the success of the first show, in June 1969, they staged an even larger event, featuring the supergroup Blind Faith.
Pink Floyd show was seminal because there was a whole lot of people at it, but it was kind of small key. We didn't promote it viciously, as it were, but the Blind Faith show was seminal insofar as they were a kind of amalgam of Cream and Traffic, with two huge bands. So they played in Hyde Park. There's 150,000 people at that. Nobody got arrested. There were no fights. It was a beautiful day. It was very kind of fey and woodland in a kind of English way.
And Sam Cutler was then contacted by the Rolling Stones. Riding high after their commercial success the previous year, they felt that a large free concert with added underground kudos would offer a suitably high-profile return to the live arena. In May, they had also fired the unreliable Brian Jones and had a new guitarist in tow, Mick Taylor, for whom this concert would provide the perfect introduction. A date was set for July, anticipation running high for the event. And then, 2 days before the show, they received news that Jones had been found dead.
A few days before the show, Brian died. So the question, of course, immediately becomes in situations like that, well, what do you do, Well, there is, of course, in the music business, and like all theatrical enterprises, there's a show must go on thing. And Mick and Keith basically felt that it should be held as a memorial to Brian.
Black Hill Enterprises started it off with very much the hippie bands playing Pink Floyd, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and then Blind Faith a bit bigger. The Stones is a different thing again. They hadn't played for a couple of years not since the busts, or so much had happened. And they came out, they released the butterflies, which promptly died. Not a great omen.
I'm free to sing my song anywhere, child. So love me, hold me, love me, hold me. I'm free to sing my song.
I thought it was one of the most awful concerts I've seen the Rolling Stones perform. I mean, they were under-rehearsed. Mick Taylor just didn't know whether he was coming or going all the way through it. Jagger dancing on dead butterflies was probably the most awfully comedic thing I've ever seen. And they were just so terribly sad, you know. It's a shame they felt they had to do it.
Outside of the performance itself, the concert was a major event, bringing together an audience of over 250,000 who were oblivious to the Stones' failings on stage. In its communal atmosphere, it echoed the peaceful unity of the San Francisco events it was emulating. And in an homage to the renowned Golden Gate Park shows, security was overseen by a very British version of the Hells Angels.
Everyone was impeccably behaved. Nobody went to hospital, no one was stabbed, no one was shot, any of that. And there were these guys that rode BSA 125 motorcycles, you know, which was like one step up from a scooter, who called themselves Hells Angels, and of course had nothing whatsoever to do with the American Hells Angels.
The Hells Angels in England, you know, they weren't California Hells Angels. They had their colors drawn on their leathers in chalk. And they were backstage at the Hyde Park concert serving tea. So if that's what the Rolling Stones thought the Hells Angels were, you know, they were in for quite severe surprise.
And soon the Stones would come face to face with the real Hells Angels. Following the Hyde Park concert, the band were making plans for a new tour, something they desperately needed to organize. Despite their resurgence in the mainstream, the band members themselves were broke. Back in 1965, manager Andrew Oldham had brought New York accountant Alan Klein into the Stones team. And over time, this tough negotiator had proven his worth to the band. Soon muscling Oldham out of the picture, by 1968, he was the band's sole manager, and his company, Abco, had control over their financial affairs and their collective bank accounts. And getting Klein to release their funds was proving increasingly difficult.
They were fed up with Alan Klein because they could never get any money out of Alan. So here they were, this world-famous band, virtually starving, and they had to do a tour of America. Basically, they knew that if they did it with Alan Klein would end up with the lion's share of the receipts, and they'd do this huge tour and have no money. So they managed, I don't know quite how, to seduce Alan Klein's nephew, Ronnie Schneider, away from his uncle's company, Abco, to come and work for the Stones and do that tour.
In August, I left my uncle. A few weeks after that, I got a phone call from Mick Jagger saying, "We want you to do this tour." And I told them that I had left Abco, and they said, "Well, we know." And I said, "You have to get my uncle's permission so that I can go. I don't want to have a family problem here." So they said they would get his permission, and what they actually did was, that was the first time I heard from Sam Cutler, what they did was they brought him over to the UK and fired him.
In firing Klein, the band's assets were immediately frozen, and the run of American shows became even more crucial for their financial survival. And at the end of the summer, while preparations for the tour were underway, a major figure from the West Coast scene arrived in London. And from here, the seeds of the free concert were sown.
What happened was that the manager of one of the managers of the Grateful Dead was a guy called Rock Scully, lovely man. He came to London, and a dear friend of his was the head of Epic Records, a guy called Chesley Millican in London. And Chesley Millican in turn was good friends with Keith and Mick. So he introduced Rock Scully from the Grateful Dead to Keith and Mick. And Rock basically was a great proselytizer for the benefits of free concerts, how wonderful it was, what was going on in San Francisco.
Rock is summoned over to Keith Richards' house, and Rock says, you know, you guys coming over to the United States, you need to play the free concert in the Golden Gate Park. I know exactly how to do that. I can fix you up. But then they also talk about how the Stones should play the Taj Mahal. And all kinds of crazy ideas come up. And, you know, Rock leaves there without really thinking that he had just offered to set up a concert for the Rolling Stones in San Francisco. But Keith remembered.
And the prospect of headlining another free concert in the heartlands of the counterculture soon became even more appealing. In the middle of August, the 3-day Woodstock Festival became a landmark event, bringing together 32 musical acts and an audience of nearly 500,000. Despite the previous year's struggles and the election of Richard Nixon, this peaceful, harmonious event proved that the counterculture was united and thriving.
The counterculture was in very healthy condition in 1969, and Woodstock was the high tide in a way. I think in 1969 we genuinely thought we were winning. We thought we were growing and we were an unstoppable force. You know, I was a teenager at the time, and that's certainly how I felt, however naive that may sound today. But I think the view that I held was one that was widely held, that we were going to change the world. We genuinely believed that. And in 1969, we didn't think anything could stop us.